don't know, we'll have to see how it sounds in testing, but in my monitoring headphones, I'm suspecting that the Icon has more self-noise than these other two. Hi, how's it going? Here are 3 microphones that are positioned as sort of budget high-end microphones. The prices vary, though none of them are the cheapest mics out there. But they claim to be budget alternatives to high-end microphones, and they are all advertised as professional studio microphones. And they are pretty blatant about which high-end microphones they are, let's say, inspired by. They all have 1-inch or larger diaphragms, but the most interesting thing is that they are all transformer designs. No transformerless mics here. So are these budget, transformer-based large diaphragm microphones any good? Let's find out. Let's start with the cheapest mic here, the ProAr C414. We'll be generous and call it a replica of an AKG C414, at least in terms of looks and the name. It doesn't have a pad, filter, or alternative pickup patterns. It's just a cardioid pickup pattern microphone. And it has a 1-inch diaphragm. Build quality is probably the worst of the 3, but not by a lot. It's a bit rough around the edges, but it's not awful, and it's the cheapest here, so it makes sense. It also includes a serviceable, if pretty cheap, shock mount, it's all plastic, and a pop filter. The pop filter seems like it should work pretty well, but it's also kind of cheap and the little mounting foot is already cracked. It also includes a fairly cheap XLR cable that should also be usable, though it did have a cold solder joint or two, so if you have issues, try another cable before you decide that the mic is bad. It's a pretty small microphone, but it has a bit of heft to it. The self-noise spec is listed as equal to or less than 18 dBA, which isn't super quiet, but it seems to be a well-regarded budget mic overall, so I'm excited to hear how it sounds. Next up is the, well, let's see. Pronunciations I've heard are Maono, 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 and maybe others. I'll just call it the PM500. It advertises a 34mm diaphragm and a self-noise spec of 20 microvolts RMS. That's not enough information to convert to anything that could be directly compared to the others, so we'll just have to see how it performs once we get to testing. It has a definite Lewitt microphone vibe to it, as in the top half is basically a Lewitt microphone. Something about the overall look doesn't quite gel for me. I mean, it's obviously a personal thing and not a big deal. It's just kind of, chunky and blocky up at the top and then kind of curved and swoopy at the bottom. Maybe it's just the Lewitt mic at the top and something else at the bottom that's messing with my brain. I don't know. Whatever, not a big deal. Moving on. This mic also comes with an XLR cable, and it's virtually identical to the ProAr cable. I don't see any cold solder joints, but it otherwise looks pretty much the same. The shock mount is fine, but the pop filter isn't really a pop filter. It's just a single layer of perfectly flat steel with little holes in it. Air just passes straight through it without really being broken up or deflected at all. In fact, the FAQ section on their website even says that it's really more of a spit blocker than a pop filter, and I'd agree with that. It's not going to do very much to block or deflect puffs of air sent towards the mic capsule. Lastly is the Icon Audio Space 103. This mic is interesting for a number of reasons, not the least of which being that Icon can't seem to make up their mind what it is. On their website, they mention it being a transformer mic, but on the box, it says transformerless. I opened it up and it absolutely has transformer output. They also say it is a classic U87 style mic. They also say it is a classic 103 style mic. Maybe it is kind of both, because a U87 has a transformer, which this mic clearly does, and yet it clearly looks like a TLM 103. Who knows? Another odd thing about the specs is that it says it has a max SPL of 123 decibels, and yet it claims to have 128 dB of dynamic range. How a mic manages to have a wider dynamic range than the loudest sound it can handle, I don't know. Unless they allow some clipping distortion on the dynamic range spec, but not in the SPL spec. I don't know, I've never seen a microphone rated that way. I originally suspected they mixed up the max SPL and dynamic range numbers, but if so, they are listed that way everywhere from the website to the spec sheet, the manual, and the box. It has a 34mm mic capsule, and the build quality is pretty good. There are some little nitpicks like an off-center hoop on the top. You can see it kind of is at an angle. An off-center sticker on the front, and one which is sort of peeling up at the back right out of the box. And there are some little chunky spots in the paint here and there, but it's all very minor. Overall impression is very good, and the shock mount also seems pretty nice. It has a self-noise spec of just 8 dBA, but it is also the most expensive mic of the group. As for looks, it's a TLM 103. If you like the look of a TLM 103, this is a intentional admitted direct copy. And lastly, it does not include a pop filter or XLR cable like the other two microphones. So let's get these microphones set up next to another microphone for reference and see how they sound. First up, I have the ProAr C414 on the right and a TLM 102 on the left. I suppose you could say this isn't a fair comparison, but first of all, unfair comparisons are fun, and all three of these microphones claim to be professional studio microphones. And in the case of the Icon, a recreated classic with no compromises. So I think it's worth finding out how they compare. Plus, feelings on the TLM 102 are kinda mixed anyway, and the self-noise spec is a relatively modest 12 dBA. So let's see how it goes. And I'll compare them all to another more fair microphone after this. But for now, how does the C414 sound? Unfortunately, I can't sing or play any instruments, so we'll just have to judge based on my voice. And in that context, how does this microphone compare to a Neumann TLM 102? Here's a moment of quiet so you can compare the noise floor. Now I'm recording with the PM500 and the TLM 102. The shock mount on the PM500 is also a bit reminiscent of Lewitt, though not as much as the mic. But either way, in use, when the shock mount is blocking the lower part of the microphone, the Lewitt vibes go up a notch. As for the pop filters, I didn't use the included filter with the C414, and I'm not using the one with the PM500 either. I don't think they would affect the sound very much, especially the one for this microphone. But they don't all come with them, and I don't often use one, so I'm just testing them without. Plus, with that cracked mounting foot with the ProAr C414 out of the box, I didn't really feel like messing with it anyway. But getting back to the PM500 specifically, this is one of the more expensive microphones that Maono sells, at least as far as I've seen. I think it is the first truly large diaphragm microphone that they outright advertise as a professional studio microphone. So, how does it sound? And how does it compare with the TLM 102? And now I'll give you a moment of quiet so that we can see how that spec of 20 microvolt RMS plays out in the real world. Now we're recording with the Space 103 and the TLM 102. The mic from Icon is obviously intentionally and specifically designed to replicate the look of a TLM 103, and I guess also somehow the U87. The diaphragm is roughly the same size as the 103, well, the Neumann TLM 103, and the self-noise spec is roughly the same as well, just 1 dB different according to the spec. And as mentioned, it is the most expensive of the three mics we're testing today. but it's obviously still a lot less expensive than the Neumann mic that it claims to be styled after. But rather than either of those mics, how does it sound compared to the baby Neumann, the 102? The 102 is a reasonably quiet mic, but with a spec of just 8 dBA, if one of these is quieter, it should be the Space 103. Here is a bit of quiet, so you can hear for yourself. Here is a bit more of a fair comparison, I suppose. I now have the ProAr C414 on the right and a Rode NT1 Signature Series on the left. The Rode is sort of like a budget mid-range mic. It's more expensive than the C414 and a bit more expensive than the PM500, but it's actually cheaper than the Space 103. And it has a lower self-noise spec than any of them and a better warranty. But how does it sound compared to these other mics? The PM500 and Space 103 are fairly similar in price to the Rode, but the C414 can be found for around half the price, so it feels more like a genuinely budget alternative, even to the Rode. So, how does it compare? Now I'm back to the PM500, but comparing it to the Rode NT1. The normal price for the PM500 is only $10 less than the NT1, so it's more of a direct competitive option rather than a budget option to the Rode. Granted, I did find it for $10 off, so that is $20 saved versus the Rode, but it doesn't feel still like a true budget option by comparison. Basically, if you don't prefer the sound, the Maono would be a tough option to justify, at least for me, given the lower build quality and far shorter warranty than the Rode. And finally, the Space 103 compared to the Rode NT1. Icon makes some pretty big claims about the Space 103, so maybe it does just sound better than the Rode. Or maybe you just really like the TLM 103 look. Either way, there's nothing wrong with preferring this microphone, but I think you will have to find something you prefer because it is slightly more expensive than the Rode. Looking around at various marketing materials, maybe I can't dock the build quality of the Space 103 for the sticker that appears off center. Apparently that's how it is on all of them, or at least in all the pictures I can find. It looks off to my brain, but maybe that's just my brain being slightly askew. So there you have it. 3 budget, large diaphragm, interesting copycat mics. Now that you've listened to them, hopefully you have some idea of whether or not any of them are right for you. But I'll give a few thoughts as well. First of all, the Space 103 is not sitting at 8 dBA of self-noise. I could hear the self-noise of this mic as soon as I put on my monitoring headphones. Self-noise certainly isn't everything when it comes to mics, and depending on your use case, it may not even be all that important. But clearly this mic is either defective or the claimed spec is simply pulled out of thin air. Thin air that's filled with the sounds of the ocean that this mic creates in the background. The PM500 wasn't actually too far behind the Space 103 on self-noise, but I didn't have super high expectations because the signal-to-noise spec is 70 dB. So I actually expected the self-noise to be a bit on the high side for a 34mm diaphragm mic. And it is. The C414 was the surprise standout of the group. It does have more self-noise than the TLM 102, but it has quite a bit less than the other 2 mics tested, which was surprising because I expected it to at least have more than the Space 103 with its 8 dBA spec. As for how they actually sounded, I thought all sounded pretty good overall. The Space 103 seemed to roll off the low end quite a bit, and it sounded the brightest overall, and not just because of the weaker low end, though that probably did play a part. The PM500 was the darkest, with slightly less sparkly highs and a fairly strong low end. The C414 I thought sat sort of in the middle, with a fairly balanced sound overall. As for value, the ProAr C414 is the killer standout here for sure. Good balanced sound, reasonable self-noise, and the least expensive by far. The shock mount and the pop filter are cheap but functional, and they could certainly be replaced if needed. It's cheap enough to be a true budget mic, and it performs pretty good. The Maono is only a bit cheaper than something like a Rode NT1 Signature Series, and it's a bit noisy. If you like the sound, it may still be appealing to you, but I'd say it's on the border of being a good value. It's certainly not a great value. The Space 103 has the best build quality and the best shock mount. It has a brighter sound than the other two if that's what you're looking for, but it's also the most expensive, and it has what I would consider a lot of self-noise for a mic like this. So I don't think I can call it a good value at this point. Unless you just really like the sound and you really like the look. But you've listened to them, so let me know what you think. If you have any questions or if you'd like to see more testing with any of these mics, let me know. And in the meantime, thanks for watching. Take care.